The purpose of today's webcast is to really give you just the general steps in developing a plan. Of course, in 1 hour, we are not able to go through every aspect or even give you the examples of how you might do every step. But we'll all four try to at least hit some of the high points, but also give you some ideas on other places that you might go to, such as NACADA resources or NACADA events that can help you. So let's begin with the initial steps. So the first thing we want to talk about is, why do we have the need for assessment? First, we need to develop that campus baseline for advising. Many times we begin by saying we want to become more effective, or we want students to gain more from the experience, but we don't really know what they're doing now and what the effectiveness might be as of today. So beginning that process gives us that baseline to go from. All of us at some point or the other have done satisfaction surveys, and they're wonderful tools to tell us about a student's satisfaction with the advising experience. But we all know that they're very limited. Obviously, many times advisors are the people who have to possibly share some bad news with the student, so that they may not particularly like what we've said, so the survey might not be very satisfactory, even though we did teach them something that was important for them to know. So we've got to move away from just doing satisfaction. Next, we need to really look at how to measure the real impact of advising, which is student learning outcomes. What do students learn from the process of academic advising? And then the very last item is probably one of the most important to me, and that is that academic advising is important, so it's worth assessing. Anything that is important enough to become a focus for the campus has to be assessed. So the longer we go without a clear assessment plan in place, the longer we are demonstrating to the campus that advising really is not an important aspect. So we want to move from that very quickly into assessment. Peter Ewell, who's one of the gurus of assessment in the country, says it is a process that focuses on student learning. I really like that, because from the very first time we see this definition, it's clear that when we assess, we're talking about learning, we're talking about teaching, that we're not just talking about a service, we're not just talking about the way we might be organized, but we want to look at what students are learning, but we're doing so in a very planned and careful way, an intentional way, that we carefully measure, carefully look at what students are learning because of their experiences with advising. So I really like that definition. Another definition says assessment is the means used to measure the outcomes of education and the achievement of students with regard to important competencies. I like this because it tells us two important things. One, if you're going to have an assessment plan, you must have outcomes, because obviously it says measure the outcomes. But two, we want to also talk about the idea of achievement of students with regard to important competencies within that. Apologize, I should have taken the phone off the hook. I'm sure Lee is over there just having a little panic attack because that happened. But the idea that we've got to establish the competencies that we want to do as we move forward. And then last, Susan Campbell, a former NACADA president and at University of Southern Maine, says assessment is the process through which we gather evidence. The word evidence to me is so powerful. It says much more than just data, much more than just facts. Because when we talk about evidence, we're talking about qualitative, we're talking about quantitative, we're talking about experiences, we're talking about every piece of the pie, not just some type of survey results. And that's so important to understand. She goes on to say about the claims we're making in regard to student learning and process and delivery of academic advising. We all make claims on our campuses. We communicate that we claim advising makes a difference in student retention, that we claim that advising is what matters in how students are successful in college. But what we really got to do is measure what we're saying in regard to those claims. So to do that, we've got to clearly assess and gather the evidence. And why? To inform and support improvement. It's all about improving the academic advising experience for our students. But as Rich and Sharon and Karen will also talk about, it's also about improving the support we provide to advisors and what we expect from advisors, because they're part of the puzzle. So, Rich, at this point, I'm going to turn it over to you and let you begin talking about missions and visions and goals. Thanks, Rich.
All right. Thank you, Charlie. Hi, everybody. Good afternoon, depending on where you are. I'm going to talk a little bit about developing a mission statement, because it does all start at the mission statement. But before I get into that, what you see in front of you and what you also have in your handouts is Peggy Mackey's assessment cycle. This assessment cycle was developed for higher education in general, not specifically for advising, but because advising is part of the teaching process of higher education, it's very easily adaptable. Can you go back, please? If you look at the assessment cycle, in the middle, you see the mission, purpose, and educational objectives of the program. That would be of the institution, that would be of the academic program, that would be of your academic advising program, depending on what it is you're assessing. Once you've identified the mission and purpose of your program and the objectives, you would identify the outcomes that you wish to measure. You would gather the evidence, interpret the evidence, and then implement change based on that evidence. This is the assessment matrix or assessment table, which basically takes Peggy Mackey's assessment cycle and breaks it down into 10 definite steps. It's based horizontally. There's a copy of this also in your packet. You may want to follow along and even write in some ideas as we go through this presentation today, and start filling out this matrix for your own campus and your own academic advising program. But it all starts with the mission statement. So what is a mission statement? Well, a mission statement describes who we serve, that would be our students and any other constituencies. Why are we here? What is our reason for being academic advisors? What role do we play? And what we strive to achieve. And what we strive to achieve, I think, is most important, because basically a mission statement is a roadmap that says where you want to go and how you plan to get there with your advising program. It includes articulation of our values, what it is we aspire to be, what we hold to be important to us in our academic advising program, our purpose, our direction now and in the future, again, the roadmap component of the mission statement. It reflects the opportunities for us to meet our mission, the competencies required, and the commitment of those involved to meet the mission. So why do we even need a mission statement? Well, unless the mission is expressed, understood, and supported, agreed upon, created, bought in by every member of the enterprise, we're at the mercy of events. So basically, if you don't have a mission, you don't have a roadmap for where you're going with academic advising, you don't know what it is you want to measure to see if you are doing what you say you're doing, and that we're providing students with what we say we're providing, then we are going to be reactive to student issues and activities and events rather than proactive in planning how we're going to work with students and provide our services to students. So a mission statement, in short, guides the decisions we make about what we do and how we want to accomplish our goals. It's a vital portion of any institutional effort to restructure or revitalize academic advising. Some of you may have a mission statement in place. For those of you who don't, you should probably start working on one. For those of you who do, you may want to revisit it from time to time. I do want to emphasize that it is not absolutely necessary to start with a mission statement before you start your assessment process. We always suggest that you start from where you're at. So if you know what the goals of your program are, but you don't have a mission statement, don't spend a year and a half arguing over a mission statement. Start with the goals and develop outcomes from there, which will be talked about in a few minutes. The Caste Standards, the Council for the Advancement of Standards in Higher Education standards, emphasize that mission statements need to be regularly reviewed and disseminated. They need to include student learning and student development, and especially because academic advising is part of the teaching and student development function of the institution, it is important that we incorporate student learning and development in our mission statements for advising. And it needs to be consistent with the vision, mission, and goals of the institution as well. So your job, if you don't already have a mission statement, is to draft one that adequately reflects what you want advising to be on your campus, to serve as your roadmap again to what you want advising to be. Oftentimes, we need to start with vision. Vision statements represent our priorities. They define what we say are important. They're aspirational statements. They don't say how we're going to get where we want to be, but they say what is important to us. For example, academic advising at X institution aspires to be the best advising program in our region. That's an aspirational statement. Then the aspirational statement, the vision statement, can drive the intent and planning for the advising and the advisor's priorities and can lead to a mission statement. There are some examples of vision statements as well in the handouts that you've received for this presentation. From the vision statement, we go to mission statement, which again is consistent with the institutional mission and vision. It includes a wide variety of constituencies, your stakeholders. It serves as a guide to the decisions we make, and it lays the foundation for assessment because it starts to begin to talk about where we want to go, what goals we want to achieve, and then we have to talk about how we're going to determine and measure whether we've met those goals. So vision to mission to goals and objectives. Goals are derived from the mission statement and identify exactly what we want the program to achieve, how we're going to meet the mission. And from goals, we identify specific objectives which articulate expectations of how advising is provided. Taken all together, you can see we go from vision to mission to goals and objectives. And as Charlie talked about earlier, this also informs how we do our academic advising. Not only is assessment important in determining what students are learning, but it's also important in us determining how we're going to present the advising, our organization of advising, the delivery, the roles and responsibilities of advisors and advisees, as well as what development and training advisors need. Once those are all in place, then we can start talking about individual advisor evaluation as well as program assessment. Characteristics of a quality mission statement: they need to be broad. They don't claim to be all things to all people. They basically provide an umbrella for our services. And they do not narrowly define what we do. They say how we're going to get where we want to go. They need to be practical, workable, and easily turned into programmatic goals. They need to be motivational as far as possibly they can be. They need to inspire commitment among the advisors. And they present the ideal of what we want to be. Short and concise, something you could tell somebody on an elevator. 25 words or less, something you could put on a t-shirt, or something you could put on the back of a business card, 3 to 4 sentences long. They need to be plain language and easily understood, avoiding higher educational or statistical jargon, and in simple sentences so anybody could read it and understand what you're saying. Here are some examples of advising mission statements. The University of Utah University College. The mission of the University College advising is to assist new transfer and transitioning students to develop and implement individual plans for achieving educational and life goals. So it tells who we are, who we work with, and what we plan to do. Indiana State University, again, who we are, what we do, we assist students, how we assist them in the development of meaning, curricular, and co-curricular plans to achieve their attainable goals. University of Louisville is a little longer, but it's who we are, what we do. We're committed to academic advising system that guides students. We help students discover, pursue various components, and to help make them engaged, self-directed learners and competent decision makers. Oregon State University, it's a teaching and learning process. It engages students in developing a plan to realize their goals. And Franklin and Marshall University focused on promoting learning and successful transitions of students, inspires in students awareness of skills, facilitate learning by engaging students, all to meet student goals. So these are just some examples of some mission statements that are already out there. I now turn it over to Karen, who will lead you through developing student learning outcomes for academic advising. Karen?
Thank you, Rich. Welcome, everyone. I'm going to talk about the student learning outcomes and the process delivery outcomes. So the first thing I want to talk about is what do learning outcomes accomplish? And as Charlie mentioned, outcomes really measure the impact of academic advising on your campuses. And as a quote from him from several years back, that learning outcomes assessment provides a clear demonstration that academic advising is a longitudinal process that reaches across the institution. So it really helps to validate that academic advising is happening on your campuses, where it's happening on your campuses, and if it's happening at all on your campuses. So really it's all about student learning, right? We want students to learn something from their academic advising experience. And what is it that we want them to learn? And how do we want them to learn those things? When do we want them? When in their careers we certainly want them to learn certain things related to academic advising. And as Rich mentioned, these should be in line with your mission statement and your goals and objectives. This should be coming out to be the next part that are associated back to whether it's your mission, your vision, and goals and objectives and what you have already established. So I want to talk about two objectives for student learning outcomes. The first being the why of academic advising. So if you just think about it in very basic, fundamental terms, why is there an academic advising program on your campus? Why does it exist? And take a few minutes to think about this, or after this webinar today, think about why there's academic advising on your campus, and why do academic advisors engage in the things that they do? Why do they engage students in those thought processes? Obviously, we want them to potentially be proactive about their careers. We want them to probe them about certain things. We want them to have certain behaviors. We want them to take ownership for their degree progress. What are those things that you want advisors to engage students to do? So it's really the purpose of academic advising on your campuses. So be thinking about that. And the second part is really the what of academic advising, measuring that, both programmatically and individually. So programmatically, think about what does the academic advising program need to do to support student learning on your campus. Certainly we want students to understand curriculum and degree requirements and those types of things. But what else do you need students, your advising program, to do to support that student learning process? And then individually, as advisors, what do you need to do to be able to support and help those students achieve that learning through academic advising? And is that training, understanding, experience, knowledge? What are those things that individually as an advisor that you need to do? So it's both the why and the what when you're thinking about your student learning outcomes. Also, you want to think beyond, student learning outcomes help you think beyond, and how the roles of academic advisors are really validated on your campus. They really define our roles as educators and facilitators of that learning. Because if you think about, if it weren't for academic advising and academic advisors, many of us have thought about the idea or been told that a computer can generate a degree out of a report. And so why do advisors exist? And so be thinking about how we are educators and facilitators of that learning process, that both learning is individual and developmental for students. All students learn differently. Students change their majors, they run into academic problems, whatever it might be, that it's not just one size fits all for students. So an academic advisor helps to guide those students with those needs. And so think about how, what are those types of things that you as advisors or as advising centers can help to provide. It also indicates a knowledge base that extends beyond the conceptual. Again, you want students to know basic fundamental information. You want them to know certain things about degree requirements and those types of things. But you also want them to go beyond that step, so that if you provide them with information, that they make those decisions on their own about utilizing resources that you have referred them to, or taking advantage of opportunities on campus, or whatever it might be that is beyond just that knowledge base. And we're going to talk about some examples here in just a few minutes. And also the other things that are related to conceptual understanding. Career development, for example. what career services and information that you have for your students. Maybe it's also tutoring. Maybe it's financial aid. Maybe it's your counseling and psychological center, as well as others that might be part of that process. So it really helps us to challenge us to professionalize the profession, that we are really making a difference and showing that impact of academic advising on your campuses. So really, the student learning outcomes are the heart of academic advising. It's the core of what we do. And we want, again, our students to learn something from the academic advising process. We want them to learn a couple of different things, both cognitive learning, behavioral learning, and affective learning. What do you want your students to know, do, and value and appreciate as a result of the academic advising process? And we're going to talk about a couple of those examples and give you a couple of examples so that you can start that process on your campus. It's important to note, and Rich mentioned, that there are a couple of resources for you to help guide in developing not only your mission statement and your goals and objectives, but also in developing your learning outcomes. And so that they're not just really arbitrary, that they really help to validate what you are doing for your assessment process on your campus. And some of those include the NACADA concept of academic advising, the NACADA core values, and the Caste Standards for academic advising. They really are helpful resources for you to determine what your outcomes might be when you're developing those student learning outcomes to measure. So some examples of what when you're thinking about as a result of the academic advising process, what do you want your students to know? Think about what you want your students to know. I've given you some examples here. Certainly you may want them to know university core requirements. You might want them to know about academic support services on campus. You might want them to know how to use the student information system, and you may want them to know how to use a course catalog. Those are some examples about the things that you want your students to know about. And certainly it goes beyond that. You want them to do certain things. They can have all the knowledge that they need from you, but you actually want them to do something with that knowledge, right? So as a result of the academic advising process, some other examples may include generate their degree audit, make an advising appointment and keep that advising appointment, ask for help, access course descriptions and degree requirements, and actually do things with the information that you've provided them, so that they really take that ownership and responsibility for their degree programs and experiences. And then lastly, what do you want students to value and appreciate as a result of the academic advising process? Obviously, you want them to value and appreciate you as an academic advisor or your unit as for academic advising, so that they continue to come back and seek out that resource. But also, what are the other things that you want them to value and appreciate? Maybe you want them to value and appreciate university core or electives. Or maybe you want them to value and appreciate taking classes outside their major and how that's important if they're, for example, a business major, and why they would have to take English. Or want them to value and appreciate the process of learning. So think about what are those types of things that you want your students to know, do, value, and appreciate as a result of their experience with academic advising. So the next part that I want to talk about is process delivery outcomes. So if we expect our students to know and do and value and appreciate certain things as a result of the academic advising process, how will they know and do and value those things if the advisors are not doing the same? So these really help relate back to the program goals and outcomes too, but they're really, what is it that advisors are expected to deliver in terms of experience and information so that the students can get these outcomes, get to these outcomes. And certainly there are different processes and people involved, different models, and we'll talk about some of those examples. But if you're going to be assessing the student learning outcomes, you really have to match that with your process delivery outcomes or your advisor outcomes. So going back to the cognitive elements with what we expect our students to know, these should really mirror in many ways what your advisors should know. If we want our students to know university core requirements, well, obviously we would want our advisors to know that information because that's where they're getting the information from. We would also want our advisors to know about academic support services and know how to use that student information system and catalog, similar to what we want our students to know. And if we want our students to do certain things again, well, we would want our advisors to do things. We would want them to participate in academic advising and training opportunities. We want them to refer students to appropriate resources. If they're a place for students to go and understand, then we would expect our advisors to know what those referral sources are and where to send them appropriately. We would certainly want them to practice ethical and legal standards, and that's a direct example from the Caste Standards with academic advising, and certainly want advisors to be accessible and available to students. So whatever those time frames might be, and how students can be able to get in touch with an advisor. So there's certainly obviously things that drive what the advising should have, what the advisors should be doing. And then lastly, the effective elements for advising. If we want our students, again, to value and appreciate university core, well, we need our advisors to do that too. And if we want our students to value and appreciate taking classes outside their major, we certainly want our advisors to be able to share that information and provide that information to students. And not just say, well, you need to take math just because you need to take math. Or you might need to just take history because you're just required to take history. And really why and how we can help them to value and appreciate that with our students. So I'm going to talk a little bit about the importance of those, again, just to reiterate and maybe give you some other examples. Really, this process delivery outcomes establishes expectations for advising professionals. It really provides sort of a guide, a job description, so to speak, for advisor professionals about what they're supposed to do, again, beyond just class registration and course scheduling for students. So that, again, students can go back and value that experience with those students, with those advisors as well. It establishes a basis for initial training and future professional development. So, for example, if you can find when you're measuring these outcomes, if and where there are gaps within these. So if you're, for example, wanting your students to value and appreciate taking classes outside their major, and the students are saying they're not doing that, and your advisors are saying, well, we talked with every student about the value of taking classes outside their major, there's obviously a disconnect, and you can provide some potential training for your advisors and or your students, depending on what that might be. And it also establishes an advising partnership between advisors, students, partners, and other stakeholders. It really builds that partnership between the advising process and ultimately that ownership and responsibility on the student, but also providing those other external constituents, those resources across campus to be part of that entire advising experience. They also establish the meaning or direction of various activities within advising and maybe how you're going to do your advising. Some examples may be the group advising or chat or individual appointments, website, even Skype now. So these outcomes help to measure how that is working for you and your unit or institution. So it really can help provide some direction in that area. And again, professionalizing the profession, showing the impact of academic advising and academic advising professionals and what we do. So just to give you some examples of how to frame some of those assessment outcome questions. We've already talked about what the academic advisors are expected to know, do, and value and appreciate when they're delivering academic advising to students. But also, what are the values, or policies, and procedures expected to communicate? So again, kind of going back to the example of if we want them to value and appreciate taking classes outside their major, how do we communicate that with advisors so that they can in turn communicate that with students? And what actions are taken by the advising unit and the advisors to deliver those services? How are you going to do that? How are you going to provide those opportunities for your students? Again, whether those are individual appointments, Skype appointments, group sessions through first-year experience programs, and really also when you're going to do that. Sharon's going to talk a little bit about the mapping process and what area, whether that's freshman, sophomore, junior, when in the process that you're going to be providing that information to your students and when the advisor should be saying and providing that certain information to them at what point. So the process delivery outcomes also help to establish, we want you to think about who's establishing these on your campus. There's certainly lots of stakeholders involved in doing so. Obviously, first and foremost, the advisors who want to do that, and maybe the directors of advising centers. But it's also important for you all to include students in that process and getting the students' feedback. I would also encourage you to think about people that may not be as supportive of advising, that can help be good stakeholders in helping you to determine what those process delivery outcomes could be, because they can also be a good advocate and communicator of what you all are trying to do on your campuses. So those might be other institutional partners as well, along with maybe your career development center again, or first year experience, or athletics, or other people that would be involved in determining what those outcomes should be on your campus, what those things are that your advisors should be delivering, and how and when they should be delivering them. And then certainly related back to your mission statement, as Rich mentioned, with regard to academic advising, whether that's within your unit or within your institution, but also maybe back to the institutional mission statement, vision statement, and otherwise goals and objectives. And again, they should relate back to the resources within NACADA and the Caste Standards, so that they can really be those credible measurements for you and your institution to be able to provide back with regard to the confirmation of that assessment for your institution. And now I'm going to turn it over to Sharon, who is going to talk about mapping.
Thank you, Karen. Good afternoon, everyone. My topic today is mapping within the assessment process, and I'm specifically going to talk about mapping outcomes and also the measurement of these outcomes within the mapping process. So what is mapping? Mapping is a process to answer key questions concerning the learning experience in advising. These questions will center on the what, the when, the where, and the how. Mapping identifies the learning outcomes very clearly. It will also identify the activities that facilitate learning. It then will go on to identify when learning competency should be achieved and when we're going to measure these learning outcomes to track this competency. Overall, mapping is a process that's giving us direction. Now, in your handouts today, you will find two pieces that augment this particular part of the webinar. One, which I do believe is on page 3 of your handouts, actually will provide in one place all of the examples I'm going to use for mapping. The other handout is at the end of the packet, and it's an example of mapping at University College Advising, where we've taken some of our pieces and shared them with you today. So let's begin. We're going to start off with the first question, which is the what question. What should be learned? And as Karen shared with us earlier, we're really focusing on the student learning outcomes at this point. So here, within your map, you'll want to clearly lay out what are the outcomes that you're looking at this point in time. Here, I've given a couple of examples. One example is the student generates a degree audit report. The second, the student communicates the value of an internship. The next question within our map will be where learning occurs. And here we're really matching the learning to the advising experiences. So some examples are your orientation program, the first year advising appointment. Possibly you've created a video that's on your website or in the YouTube library. Also, there could be courses where advising is meeting some of the learning outcomes, such as a first year course or a major course or a senior seminar. Now we're going to go to the when. When should learning occur? And this is important to be sure that you understand when you're expecting certain learning outcomes to match to the advising experiences. So it could be in a particular term, such as the first term or the second term, or it could be at the end of the first year. It also could be at the end of a particular experience, such as completing a course. This slide puts together the three questions that we have just gone through, the what, the where, and the when in mapping. So the what, again, the student learning outcome that you are thinking about at this point in time, that you are directing your activities to. Then we're going to think about where does that learning occur, in what particular activity of advising. And then finally, the when. When are we expecting the learning to occur and the competency to be achieved? Next, let's just stop for a minute and talk a little bit about the steps to mapping. I think it's important to pick your learning outcomes and take one learning outcome at a time. Next, identify those advising activities that actually contribute to this particular outcome and provide the information that the student needs to learn this particular concept. Then you'll need to go on to identify when the competency is expected. After you've completed one, start again with another student learning outcome and go through to set up your map. Now let's talk about the next step in mapping, which is the measuring part. It's very important to actually be able to show that this learning is going. And as Charlie talked about earlier in the webinar, we need to be gathering evidence, and that's what the measuring will do. So here we're going to focus on questions such as when, how, and how often. When should learning be measured? This is a very important point. When do you actually expect to see the competency? Or are you trying to see gradual competency? Very important to think about that. So here, a couple different answers to the when question might be at the end of the first year, could be at the end of any year of the student's experience, it could be after so many visits to the advising office. Next is how will learning be measured? Now, in an assessment process, it's very important to remember that we need to have multiple measures for gathering our evidence. So it's important to sit down and think about the different methods that you might use and how these different methods might actually gather evidence for different learning outcomes. So some examples of methods that we can use are surveys, possibly observations of a particular advising session. Maybe we can collect data that actually shows numbers that would indicate learning or an increase of activity. Maybe also we're using a pre and a post-test instrument. We also need to think about how often. How often do we actually have to engage a particular measure when we're gathering this information? We might actually use the measure once a year. We might use it every term. We might actually do it at the beginning and the end of a particular experience. So now continuing on with our map, we're going to add in the measurement elements of this. For this particular example, I'm just going to focus on one particular student learning outcome, and that is student generates a degree audit report. We're going to go over to the how as far as measurement goes and just focus on this first line. In this particular one, we're going to actually observe students at their second appointment with their degree audits. We could be looking at certain elements of the degree audit to make sure that the student understands that this can indicate catalog year. It also indicates types of degrees, and there could be other elements that are important that the student is drawing upon when they're pulling their degree audit. We might decide that we're going to do this particular element at the end of the second term, and that we're only going to look at this once a year as far as observing what our students know how to do with the degree audit. Another way to measure students generating a degree audit could be to actually look at some numbers. Go in and actually look at how many audits your freshmen run at their first term of enrollment versus second and future terms. You could decide to do this at the end of a particular term, such as the second term, and that you're only going to do this once a year or annually. The importance of mapping is multiple. First off, it aligns advising activities with the student learning outcomes. It's very important to make sure that we're delivering advising that is addressing the learning that we expect our students to accomplish. Second, it establishes a point to measure learning. It's very clear on what are the learning outcomes and when will we be measuring them and how will we be measuring them. It identifies where you give the students the opportunity to learn, to practice, to develop, and to demonstrate. Why should we be doing mapping? Well, first off, it makes us reflect on the connection between advising and learning and how we're going to actually show that through measurement. It also matches the expectations of students to the practice of advising. It provides an excellent visual representation of learning and advising, showing exactly when you expect certain concepts to be learned in the advising process. And then it makes it a great technique to communicate with our stakeholders on the fact that advising does contribute to learning within our environment. As I mentioned at the beginning of my section, we do have some resources in the packet for mapping for you. As I indicated, there is a handout that goes through all the examples that we've just talked through in this particular section. There's also a handout that was provided from University College at the University of Utah that actually addresses elements of mapping and shows you just one way to set up a map. In this particular example, we start out with the what's, or the student learning outcomes, and they go across the top of the map. Then on the left-hand side, we actually show you the different programs and then the different advising activities within those programs and how they relate to the different learning outcomes. We have a key that's across the top that is very clear on a particular activity introducing a student learning outcome, reviewing a student learning outcome, or might be the point where we actually look for competency in that particular student learning outcome. On the left-hand side of this particular map, you will see how we're going to gather evidence. We lay out our measurement tools. So you'll see a number of different tools listed there, such as a prescriptive survey, a rubric, observations, and data on a particular concept or issue. And then finally, as we draw full circle on the assessment cycle, you will see a column there for results and suggested changes. This, after we go through and we review and analyze our evidence, we can see what we have achieved within the learning process and what changes we need to make as we move into the next cycle of assessment. In addition to these resources, don't forget that the NACADA assessment monograph on CD also offers more information on mapping as well as other elements of the assessment process that we've talked about today. At this point, I'm going to turn it back to Charlie, who's going to talk more about resources as well as take some questions. Charlie?
Thank you, Sharon. I want to reiterate what Sharon said, and that is for everyone to remember that the Assessment Institute will be held this year in San Diego, February 15th through the 17th. It's the first time we've been back on the West Coast in 3 years, so we'll be excited to see a lot of you there, but also those of you on the West Coast. We have a couple of questions that we're going to take and have you respond to just kind of quickly here. Rich, I'm going to ask you to take the first question from Avi. Can we imagine using an advising mission statement that doesn't reflect the campus mission statement? And why should advising statements do more than just repeat the institutional mission?
All right, well, no, I cannot imagine an advising statement that doesn't reflect the campus's mission statement, and for a couple of reasons. Number one, most university or college mission statements do state that we are learning institutions, that we promote lifelong learning, and all those things that are involved in student learning. And since we do consider advising a form of teaching and learning, then we need to be providing, achieving that mission as well. So our local mission statement for advising should definitely reflect the campus mission statement. It needs to go beyond the campus mission statement, though, because we are talking specifically about what we're going to do in academic advising to meet our local programmatic goals, which then track back to meeting the institutional mission statement. So it should incorporate aspects of the campus mission statement, but not necessarily simply repeat the campus mission statement. Go beyond that and say how we're going to meet our local mission statement, which then will meet the institutional mission statement.
Very good. I would probably add to what Rich said, in that because so many campuses are becoming very data-driven in their funding, that they're looking at assessment results. Clearly, if your mission statement does not reflect your institutional mission statement, you're going to have a hard time in the funding request, because you're going to look like you're doing something totally outside the mission of the institution. Sharon, we also have a question that says, does checking the outcomes in a map annually mean for all students each year, or longitudinally as students go through a program? What's your recommendation on how people do that?
That's really going to depend upon the learning outcome and how you've decided to measure it. So in some situations, it's going to be where you're going to take the whole cohort and you're going to look at information periodically throughout their experience at the institution. At other times, you might be taking a sample and you're going to look at them at a particular period. So again, it just really goes back to the learning outcome, and decided that you're going to pull evidence based on a number of different factors.
Very good. And I think I would add to what Sharon said as well. In addition to the outcome itself, I think we need to think about doing things such as having a sample to look at. Of course, if you've got 5,000 students, you're not going to check all 5,000 students on every single outcome. And so that becomes a real aspect as you look through that.
Charlie, can I add to
Karen, we have someone ask a question. Elaine Borelli. Hello, Elaine. Glad to see you. Can you speak about crafting and measuring outcomes that do the student value and appreciation of academic advising? The one that we know is the most difficult of the three.
Well, I think that what you have to do is the question maybe because of, if you're asking for examples about questions, the one that I was talking most about was, for example, if you were to do it on a survey, for example, you may send something like, because of my advising process, I value and appreciate taking classes outside my major, would be an example if you were to put that on some sort of survey question. And C, and again, reflecting it directly back to the advising, and seeing if students have an interpretation that because of their advisor, they learned about how to value and appreciate that. There's certainly some other examples, but in the form of a question, that would be an example of doing so.
Very good. Rich or Sharon, you want to add anything to that Karen mentioned?
I'd like to say that oftentimes the way to measure the affect is to utilize alumni, because students often aren't aware of the importance or appreciate what's going on while they're going through the process. So right. Utilizing alumni as stakeholders, but also as part of your assessment, and ask them, 5 or 10 years out, how valuable it was at the time, now that they've been away from it for a while, and how much advising did play a role in appreciation of the liberal arts and what they're doing today and so forth.
Great. Sharon, any comments from you?
No, I just agree with Rich and with Karen on what they've said concerning the affective. It's one of the more challenging that we have to try to measure.
Absolutely. It's also the one that people will want to avoid or hold out from unless you force them, because it's hard to measure, they're really afraid that someone on the campus is going to question them because it's difficult to measure. But I think if we looked across an institution, obviously those effective outcomes, dealing with lifelong learning and those types are always the outcomes for any program that you may not be able to measure until the students have been away for a while. So if you have a graduation survey, or if you have an alumni survey that you do on a regular basis, you definitely want to meet with your institutional research or your institutional assessment person to talk about having those types of effective survey items or measurements put on those types
I
of
would say one more
surveys that
thing
go out.
with regard to the outcomes. Don't let them scare you. Try to develop questions about what you want your students to know, do, value, and appreciate without worrying about how you're going to measure them.
Very good, Karen. If you start to get worried about how you measure them first, you'll never have any outcomes other than the cognitive, because they're easy to measure. So you really want to work with that on your campuses and push people to go beyond those. Well, I think that's all the questions we have and all the time we have for today. I really want to thank Rich and Karen and Sharon once again. We do have one more question that just came in. Oh, a very good question. As a member of NACADA, I'm trying to develop an assessment plan for the School of Nursing and get the institutions to buy in by next fall 2012. Well, Norma, you're going to be really busy in the next 6 months. Obviously, Norma, you're not going to be able to do everything that we've talked about in 6 months. I'm going to let maybe Karen begin. Karen, you could talk a little bit about the process you used at University of Arkansas and the time it took you to move forward.
I'm sorry to disappoint, but Charlie's right in terms of the timing, because for the most part, the folks that will be doing advising, whether it's in your unit or at your institution, will be in addition to what they're currently doing. And so if you're trying to gather some people together to formulate a task force or a committee, so to speak, at my institution, we probably worked for a good year just in developing the mission, goals, and objectives and associated outcomes, and how we were going to measure them before we could ever even get any data, before we ever even were able to access any kind of data. And that was working by and large probably at least every couple of weeks at lunch through 5 o'clock. And so each of at my institution, we did it institutionally wide, and we all got together probably every 2 to 3 weeks, and with the exception of some busy times like orientation or registration and those types of things. And it took a good 4 or 5 hours just to get through that first part of the process. But don't let that scare you from doing it.
Very good, Sharon. Of course, Norma's talking about just one school, so time might not be quite that long or difficult to get people together. Sharon, you were shaking your head as far as the time frame. Did you find the same thing at the U?
Sure, yeah, it definitely took us a good 2 years to get everything up and rolling. One of the things, though, that I would really encourage Norma to think about is what's already out there and available that she might be able to use. And that really helped our efforts at the University of Utah tremendously. We went to our Office of Institutional Analysis, and they were great partners to show us what they already had collected concerning advising, and then to work with us on what we could also collect in the future. So I would really say talk to your colleagues out there, talk to some of the central institutional resources, and see what they can do to assist you with this process.
Very good. Norma, I also would highly recommend that you really do your very best to either get yourself to or bring a team to the Assessment Institute in San Diego. That's 2.5 days of hard work that you'll be able to get a good bit started on at least your mission and your vision and your goals to go back and then continue with you and get on your campus. Part of the problem in time, as Karen talked about, is you all have full-time jobs. So the opportunity of coming to the Assessment Institute and having 2.5 full days just to focus on that would really help. Rich, anything you want to add to that?
Both Karen and Sharon were describing their process. They used we. And I noticed in Norma's question it says, I am trying to develop an assessment plan. You need to have a team. It's not a one-person job. It's impossible to do as one person. So you need to identify your stakeholders, and from your stakeholders you need to develop an assessment team. either program-wide if it's for your program, or in your case school-wide for the School of Nursing, and work together on it. And one thing I would suggest is include any naysayers on that team, to bring them in from the beginning, to help them buy into the process as you go along.
Very good. It would also be beneficial to you, Norma, to get the academic advising today. The assessment CD, because that will walk you through what we've talked about. I will tell you from my experience, health programs, nursing programs have a better understanding than some of our liberal arts programs, because you deal with nursing plans for patients, and in some ways those are the same types of things that we talk about with an assessment. So I think you'll find you'll have some little assistance from that within your own area. So Rich and Karen and Sharon, thank you once again for being a part of this. We really are thrilled to have you here. All of you who participated, thank you. Please don't hesitate to contact us. Our contact information is there on the screen for you. All four of us will be more than happy to assist you at any time. We look forward to seeing you at the Assessment Institute and the Administrators Institute in San Diego this coming February. And all of you have a great afternoon. Thank you so much.
Bye.